The wind was a living thing, a predator that howled across the Wyoming plains. It clawed at the walls of the derelict stagecoach station, rattling the lone window in its frame and forcing fine, stinging particles of snow through every crack and crevice. Inside, the darkness was nearly absolute. A thick, cold blanket broken only by the faintest gray light filtering through the grime on the glass. In one corner, huddled as far from the door as she could manage, Alara pressed herself against the rough-hewn logs. Cold had seeped deep into her bones, a paralytic chill that made her teeth ache and her muscles tremble in a continuous, exhausting shudder. She had been running for 3 days, or was it 4? Time had blurred into a desperate cycle of fear and flight. The men she had escaped were a constant presence in her mind, their rough laughter, the possessive grip of their hands, the dead look in their eyes as they discussed her future as if she were a side of beef. Her father's face, weak and pleading as he'd accepted a handful of coins, was a ghost that haunted her waking moments. She had slipped away in the dead of night, taking nothing but the worn dress on her back and a sliver of hope that felt as fragile as a sparrow's egg. The storm, in its terrifying fury, had been a blessing, covering her tracks, driving her pursuers to seek shelter of their own. She had stumbled upon this station by sheer luck, a dark shape against the swirling white, a ruin that promised, if nothing else, a barrier against the wind. The station was a single room, smelling of dust, decay, and the faint, lingering scent of horses long gone. A stone hearth stood cold and black against one wall, a gaping mouth filled with ash. A broken table and 2 mismatched chairs were the only furniture, their surfaces coated in a thick layer of grime. She had explored it with trembling hands in the last vestiges of daylight, finding nothing of use. No food, no blankets, nothing but the cold, hard reality of her isolation. Now, with the full force of the blizzard upon her, she could only wait. She listened to the storm, her senses stretched taut, every creak of the old building sending a jolt of pure terror through her. They could still be out there. They were hunters, and she was their quarry. The thought was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. Her world had shrunk to this small, dark space, to the gnawing emptiness in her stomach and the profound, soul-deep weariness that threatened to pull her under. She had tried to sleep, but her fear was a relentless sentinel. Her eyes burned from staring into the oppressive blackness. Her ears strained to separate the sounds of the storm from any man-made noise that might signal her discovery. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep, every rattle of the window like a hand testing the latch. She was a cornered animal, heart hammering against her ribs, every nerve fiber screaming a silent prayer for the dawn. Then came a sound that was not the wind. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding outside the door, followed by a low whinny, quickly swallowed by the gale. Alara froze, the blood turning to ice in her veins. Her breath hitched in her throat. They had found her. The thought was a white-hot spike of panic. She scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the splintered wood of the wall, searching for a weapon, a hiding place, anything. But there was nowhere to go. The room was a box, a trap. A heavy fist slammed against the door, making the entire structure shudder. It wasn't a tentative knock. It was a demand. Alara squeezed her eyes shut. A strangled sob caught in her throat. This was it. The brief, desperate flight was over. The thick wooden bar holding the door shut groaned under the pressure of a heavy shoulder. Wood splintered, with a final, violent crack. The door flew open, torn from its upper hinge, and slammed against the interior wall. A maelstrom of snow and wind exploded into the room, a blinding, frigid vortex that extinguished the last of the room's meager warmth. Framed in the doorway against the swirling chaos of white was the silhouette of a man. He was immense, a giant who filled the entire opening. The wind whipped his long duster coat around him, making him seem even larger, a creature born of the storm itself. Alara couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She could only stare, her mind a blank slate of terror. He stood there for a long moment, letting the storm rage into the small space, his head turning slightly as his eyes adjusted to the deeper darkness within. Then, with a motion of profound weariness, he stepped inside and used his entire body to force the broken door back into its frame, propping it shut with one of the chairs. The roar of the blizzard was instantly muffled, reduced once more to a tormented howl outside the walls. The sudden, relative quiet was deafening. He did not look at her. Slowly, methodically, he began to shed his outer layers. A wide-brimmed hat, heavy with melted snow, was dropped onto the dusty table. Water streamed from it, carving clean rivulets in the grime. His leather duster followed, so soaked it made a wet slap as it hit the floor. He wore a simple wool shirt and dark trousers, all of it clinging to a frame that was lean but powerful. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived in hard places, where no energy was wasted. Every muscle in Alara's body was coiled tight, ready to spring, but she stayed pressed into her corner, trying to make herself invisible. The man walked to the center of the room, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the floorboards. He knelt by the cold hearth, pulling a small oilskin pouch from his saddlebags, which he dropped near the door. Alara watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, as he laid out a piece of flint, a steel striker, and a small bundle of tinder. He worked with a quiet, single-minded focus, as if he were the only person in the world. He seemed utterly oblivious to her presence, or perhaps he simply did not care. The sharp, scraping sound of steel on flint echoed in the small room. Once, twice, on the third strike, a shower of sparks bloomed in the darkness. One caught in the tinder. The man hunched over it, his broad back shielding the nascent flame from any stray draft, and blew on it with a gentle, steady breath. A tiny orange glow appeared, fragile and precious. He nurtured it, adding small twigs and strips of bark he must have carried with him, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising delicacy. The flame caught, grew, and began to dance. Light pushed back the shadows, painting the room in flickering shades of yellow and orange. For the first time, Alara could see him clearly. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his late 20s. His face was all harsh lines and sharp angles, weathered by sun and wind. A dark, untrimmed beard covered his jaw, and his hair, damp with the melted snow, was the color of dark earth. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, startling gray, and they were filled with a weariness so profound it seemed to pull at the very bones of his face. There was no cruelty in them, no avarice. There was just nothing, an emptiness that mirrored the desolate landscape outside. As the fire grew stronger, casting a growing circle of warmth and light, he finally lifted his head and looked directly at her. Alara's breath caught. His gaze wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was a simple, straightforward acknowledgement of her existence. He looked at her huddled form, at her thin, torn dress, at the wild fear in her eyes. His expression did not change. His face remained a stoic, unreadable mask. He held her gaze for a long, silent moment, and then he simply looked away, turning his attention back to the fire as if the matter was settled. He had seen her, and he had done nothing. He had not shouted, had not lunged, had not ordered her out into the storm. The simple fact of his inaction was so contrary to everything she had come to expect from men that it left her confused, her terror momentarily short-circuited. He fed larger pieces of wood into the fire, scavenged from the broken remains of a crate in the far corner of the room. The flames leapt higher, roaring in the hearth, chasing the biting cold back into the walls. The warmth began to spread, a blessed, life-giving sensation that touched Alara's frozen skin. She felt the tight knot of ice in her belly begin to loosen. Just a fraction. Her shivering, though it did not stop, became less violent. The man settled on the floor, his back against the stone of the hearth, but he kept a careful distance from her side of the room. He pulled a strip of dried meat from his bags and began to chew on it slowly, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. He ate like he did everything else, with a slow, deliberate purpose that suggested a deep and abiding patience. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the mournful cry of the wind. Minutes bled into an hour. The man said nothing. He did not move from his spot by the fire, save to add another log. He did not look at her again. He simply sat, a silent, unmoving figure of weary strength, sharing his fire with a ghost in the corner. For Ilara, who had known nothing but harsh commands and rough hands for weeks, his silence was a strange and unnerving gift. It was a space, a void, where she expected a threat to be, and in that empty space, a single, bewildering thought took root: he wasn't going to hurt her. He was just a man, as tired and as cold as she was, seeking shelter from the same storm. The realization did not erase her fear, but it changed its shape, softening its sharpest edges into a wary, watchful stillness. The storm raged on outside, but within the small, fire-lit room, an unspoken truce had been declared, forged not with words, but with shared warmth and a profound and absolute silence. The warmth from the hearth was a slow, creeping thing. It did not banish the cold so much as push it into the corners of the room, leaving the space around the fire as a small island of reprieve in an ocean of frigid air. For a long time, Ilara did not move. She remained pressed into the wall, a statue carved from fear, watching the silent man. He had finished his meager meal and now sat staring into the flames. His posture relaxed but not unguarded. He seemed a part of the landscape, as rugged and enduring as the rock formations that dotted the plains. The light played across the hard planes of his face, making shadows pool in the hollows of his cheeks and under his brow, rendering his expression even more inscrutable. His silence was a heavy blanket. At first it had been a source of terror, the prelude to a violence she felt was inevitable. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, then two, the nature of the silence began to change. It was not the menacing quiet of a predator stalking its prey. It was something else entirely, a deep, settled quiet that seemed to emanate from the man himself. He was not waiting. He was simply being. He existed in this space with a solidity that was both intimidating and, in a strange, inexplicable way, calming. He was a mountain. He was not concerned with the frightened rabbit hiding at his base. Ilara's body, betrayed by the encroaching warmth, began to signal its profound exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained her for days was finally ebbing, leaving behind a leaden weariness. Her eyelids felt heavy as stones. The gnawing ache in her belly was a constant, dull throb. Sleep, which had been an impossibility, now began to beckon to her, a siren call promising a temporary escape from the waking nightmare of her life. But sleep was a vulnerability she could not afford. To close her eyes was to surrender her watchfulness, her only defense. The men she had fled from preyed on the weak, the sleeping, the unguarded. Every instinct, honed by weeks of terror, screamed at her to stay awake. She watched the man, whose name she did not know, looking for any sign of a shift in his demeanor, a flicker of interest, a predatory glance, anything that would confirm her fears. But there was nothing. His gaze remained fixed on the fire. He seemed lost in its depths, perhaps seeing memories or futures in the shifting embers. The sheer self-containment of him was unnerving. He required nothing from the world, and seemingly nothing from her. He moved, and her entire body went rigid. It was a slow, deliberate motion. He stretched his arms over his head, his back arching with a faint groan of tired muscles. Then he reached for his saddlebags, which lay near him on the floor. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The quiet was over. He was reaching for a weapon, a rope, something to bind her with. She squeezed her hands into fists, her short, dirty fingernails digging into her palms. But he only pulled out a heavy, rolled-up object, a bedroll. It was made of thick, oiled canvas on the outside. He untied the leather straps and unrolled it on the floor. Inside was a dark wool blanket, folded neatly. It looked incredibly thick, incredibly warm. He placed it a careful distance from the fire, not so close as to be a hazard, but near enough to catch its heat. He had laid his claim to a piece of the floor, staking out his territory for the night. The finality of the gesture broke through Alara's paralysis. The night was no longer an abstract stretch of time. It was here, and it had to be survived. This room, which had been a temporary shelter, was now to be a shared sleeping space. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She could not, would not, sleep in a room with a strange man. She would sit in her corner, awake and freezing, until morning. But even as she made the vow, she knew it was a lie. Her body was failing her. The shivers were returning, not from the room's ambient chill, but from a deep, internal cold born of hunger and exhaustion. Soon, she would not be able to keep her eyes open. And then what? She had to say something. She had to draw a line. Her voice had been stolen from her by fear and disuse, and the thought of speaking, of making a sound that would draw his full attention, was terrifying. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was to leave his intentions to chance, to hope his indifference would last through the night. Hope was a luxury she'd lost the right to long ago. She took a breath, but it hitched in her throat, dry and ragged. She tried again, forcing the air from her lungs. "Don't," she whispered. The word was barely a sound, a rustle of dry leaves, easily lost in the crackle of the fire. She wasn't even sure she had said it aloud. But the man heard. His head turned slowly, and his pale gray eyes found her in the shadows. This time, his gaze was not a passing glance. It was direct, questioning. He didn't speak, he just waited, his expression unchanged. His focused attention was like a physical weight. Alara forced herself to meet his eyes, her own wide with a desperate, pleading terror. She had to make him understand. "Don't come over here," she said, her voice a little stronger this time, though it still trembled. "You stay on your side. I'll stay on mine." She expected a range of reactions, a mocking laugh, an angry retort, a dismissive shrug. She expected him to challenge her, to ask what a girl like her was doing alone in a place like this, to assert his strength and his right to the entire space. The men who had bought her would have laughed. They would have told her she had no sides, that every part of her belonged to them. The stranger did none of those things. He simply held her gaze for a few seconds longer, his eyes seeming to look right through her, to see the ragged, terrified creature she had become. Then he gave a single, slow nod. And that was all. He turned back to his bedroll, his movements as unhurried as before. He picked up the thick wool blanket, the one he had just laid out for himself. For a terrible moment, she thought he was taking it away, punishing her for her audacity by retracting the shared warmth of his fire. But he walked not towards her, but parallel to the hearth, and tossed the blanket across the floor. It landed in a heap a few feet from where she was huddled, well within her space, on her side of the invisible line she had drawn. He returned to his spot, taking only the canvas shell of his bedroll, and lay down on the hard planks, his back to her, facing the fire. He used his saddlebags as a pillow and pulled his duster coat over himself. It was a poor substitute for the warmth of the wool he had just given away. Alara stared at the blanket. It was a dark, shapeless mass in the flickering light. A peace offering. A promise. It was the single kindest gesture anyone had shown her in months. It was so unexpected, so contrary to the harsh rules of the world she now inhabited, that it brought a hot, painful lump to her throat. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Crying was another weakness she could not afford. Slowly, hesitantly, as if it might be a trap, she crawled from her corner. Her limbs were stiff and clumsy, She reached out a trembling hand and touched the wool. It was rough, smelling faintly of horse, leather, and the cold, clean scent of the man himself. She pulled it towards her, wrapping it around her thin shoulders. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming. It was a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to sink right through her skin and into her very bones. It was the warmth of 100 nights spent under the stars, the accumulated comfort of a man who knew how to survive the cold. She huddled into it, pulling her knees to her chest, burying her face in the thick folds. For the first time in days, the violent shivering that had racked her body began to subside. She retreated back to her corner, a small, blanket-shrouded figure on her side of the room. On the other side, the man lay still, his breathing low and even. He seemed to have fallen asleep instantly, with the ease of one whose body is accustomed to hardship and whose conscience is clear. Or perhaps he was just pretending. She did not know. The fire slowly died down, the leaping flames sinking into a bed of glowing, pulsing embers. The light in the room softened, the shadows growing longer and deeper. Outside, the wind still howled its fury, but inside, a fragile peace had settled. Ilara lay awake, her eyes open in the near darkness, her senses still on high alert. But the frantic, screaming edge of her fear had been blunted. She listened to the man's steady breathing, a quiet rhythm in the heart of the storm. He had not questioned her. He had not bargained with her. He had seen her fear, heard her command, and had simply complied. He had given up his own comfort to offer her a small measure of it, asking for nothing in return. She thought of all the men she had known in her short, hard life. Her father, whose gaze had slid past her, seeing only the coin she might fetch, the merchants, the travelers, the hunters at the trading post, their eyes always lingering, assessing, pricing, and the men she had just escaped, whose looks had stripped her bare, leaving her feeling like an object, a piece of livestock to be used and discarded. They all looked, but they never truly saw her. This man, this stranger, had looked at her, in that first moment, when his eyes had met hers across the darkened room. She had seen no hunger, no calculation. She had seen only a weary recognition. He had seen another soul seeking shelter from the storm. He looked at her not as a woman, not as a prize, but as a person. And then he had given her the dignity of looking away. Huddled in the darkness, wrapped in the warmth of a stranger's blanket, a single, revolutionary thought formed in Ilara's mind, clear and sharp as a shard of ice. For the first time, a man hadn't looked at her like she was for sale. The thought did not make her trust him. Trust was a currency she no longer possessed, but it carved out a small, quiet space within her fear, a space where she could breathe. She watched his still form across the room, the broad line of his back, the steady rise and fall of his shoulders with each breath. He had drawn no weapon. He had made no threat. He had offered a blanket and silence. Perhaps, just for tonight, that was enough. Her eyes, heavy with an exhaustion that was now more powerful than her fear, began to drift shut. The howl of the wind became a lullaby. The steady breathing from across the room became a quiet promise of the dawn. For the first time in a long, long time. Ilara slept. Sleep had not been a peaceful country. It was a gray, featureless landscape of shallow valleys and sharp peaks of anxiety, haunted by the echoes of rough voices and the phantom sensation of being watched. Ilara drifted in and out of it, never truly resting, her body still coiled in a knot of vigilance. When she finally surfaced into a state that resembled wakefulness, the world felt wrong. The faint gray light of dawn was seeping through the grimy window, but it seemed too bright, pressing against her eyelids with a painful intensity. The cold was different now. It was no longer a simple chill on her skin. It had burrowed deep inside her, a fire that burned with ice, making her bones ache and her teeth chatter with a rhythm that was frantic and uncontrollable. A wave of dizziness washed over her. and the rough-hewn walls of the station seemed to tilt and sway. She tried to push herself up, to reassume her defensive crouch in the corner, but her limbs were heavy and unresponsive, imbued with a strange, syrupy weakness. The thick wool blanket, which had been a profound comfort just hours before, now felt suffocating, its weight an unbearable burden. She was hot and cold all at once, a deep tremor running through her that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the rebellion of her own body. Through the fog of her growing fever, she saw him, called her. He was already awake, kneeling by the hearth, coaxing the embers from the night back into a proper fire. He moved with the same quiet economy she had noted before, a man who wasted no motion and no breath. His silhouette was dark and solid against the growing flames, a fixed point in her swimming vision. She watched him, her mind slow and muddled. The fear was still there, a low, constant hum beneath the surface, but it was muffled by the sheer misery of her physical state. It was hard to be terrified when every joint was screaming in protest, and her head felt as if it were packed with hot sand. He must have heard the renewed, violent chattering of her teeth, or perhaps he simply sensed the change in the room's atmosphere. He turned his head and looked at her, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than it had the night before. His face was, as always, unreadable, but his pale eyes were narrowed slightly, observant. He saw not just a girl huddled in a blanket, but the unnatural flush on her cheeks, the glassy sheen in her eyes, the fine tremors that shook her frame. He saw the sickness. Without a word, he stood up. He scanned the derelict room, his eyes finally landing on a dented tin pot half buried in a pile of debris in the far corner. He retrieved it, wiped the worst of the grime from its interior with a cloth from his bag, and then walked to the broken door, shoving it open just enough to create a gap. He used the pot to scoop a mound of clean, white snow from the drift outside, letting in a brief, punishing blast of frigid air before he shouldered the door shut again. He set the pot on a flat stone he'd positioned at the edge of the flames, and the snow within it immediately began to melt. Alara watched the entire process through a haze. Each of his actions was simple, practical, and yet she could not decipher their purpose. Her feverish mind, steeped in suspicion, tried to twist his intentions into something menacing. The pot was for boiling. Something. The water was for what her thoughts were fragmented, nonsensical. She closed her eyes, but the dizzying sensation only worsened. She was trapped, not just in the station, but inside a body that was failing her. The realization brought a fresh spike of panic, sharp and cold, that cut through the fever's heat. The snow melted into bubbling water. Calder let it grow hot, then took a tin cup from his saddlebags and dipped it into the pot. He stood up and, for the first time, took a deliberate step toward her side of the room. He crossed the invisible line. Alara's eyes flew open, her breath hitched. Every nerve ending screamed in alarm. He was coming. The truce was over. She tried to scramble backward, to put more distance between them, but her body betrayed her. She could only manage a weak, pathetic shuffle, her back scraping against the log wall. He stopped a few feet away, careful not to loom over her. He knelt down, bringing himself closer to her level, an action that should have been less intimidating but somehow was not. It was too intimate, too close. He held out the tin cup. Steam rose from it in a faint, wavering ribbon. "Drink," he said. His voice was a low rumble, the first word he had ever spoken to her. It was rough from disuse, but steady. She stared at the cup, then at his face. Her mind screamed, "No, do not take anything from him. Do not show weakness. Do not let him get this close." She shook her head, a small, jerky movement. His expression did not change. His arm remained extended, his hand steady. "You've got a fever," he stated. It wasn't a question or a diagnosis. It was a simple fact. "The chill's gone into your blood. Drink this, it'll help." She shook her head again. more forcefully this time, and pressed herself harder against the wall, as if she could melt through the wood and escape. A whimper, small and animalistic, escaped her lips. For the first time, a flicker of something passed through his eyes. It wasn't anger. It looked more like impatience. Not with her, but with the sickness itself. "There's nothing in it but water," he said, his voice still low, but with a new edge of command. "Girl, you can fight me, or you can fight the fever. You don't have the strength to do both. Drink." His logic was brutal and inescapable. She was weak, so terribly weak. The shivering was growing worse, and black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She could feel her own life force, a flickering little candle, threatening to be extinguished by the icy wind of the sickness. To refuse was to surrender to the illness. To accept was to place a sliver of trust in this man, a man she knew nothing about, except that he hadn't hurt her yet. Her gaze darted from his unyielding face to the steaming cup. Her throat was parchment dry. Slowly, with a hand that shook so badly she could barely control it, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against his. His skin was rough and calloused, but warm. The contact, brief as it was, sent a jolt through her, part fear, part a desperate craving for human warmth. She snatched the cup from him, her movements clumsy, sloshing some of the hot water onto her hand. She barely felt the sting. She brought the cup to her lips and drank. The water was scalding, but the intense heat felt good, a shock to her system that seemed to momentarily clear her head. It coursed down her throat and into her belly, a core of warmth that began to fight back against the deep-seated chill. She drank it all, greedily, then lowered the cup, her breathing coming in ragged gasps. The relief was immediate, but fleeting. The sudden infusion of heat seemed to drain the very last of her reserves. The world, which had been tilting, now began to spin in earnest. The fire, the walls, the man's face, it all dissolved into a meaningless blur of light and shadow. The tin cup slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered onto the floorboards. A low groan escaped her as she slumped sideways, her strength utterly gone. She felt herself falling, and then strong arms were there, catching her before she hit the floor. Panic, pure and absolute, exploded in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. He was touching her. His hands were on her, one supporting her back, the other under her knees. He was lifting her, his strength effortless. Her mind, untethered by fever, was thrown back into the darkness of her memories. The feeling of being held down, of rough hands that took and tore, of her own voice pleading, unheard. A scream built in her throat, but it came out as a choked, desperate whisper. "Don't!" Her hands, which had no strength, still came up to push weakly against his chest. "Please, don't!" He stopped moving. He held her there, halfway between the floor and wherever he meant to take her. He lowered his head, and his voice was a low murmur, right beside her ear. A sound meant only for her, a sound that cut through the roaring panic in her mind. "I'm not one of them." The words were a lifeline thrown into a raging sea. They were not an apology or a promise, but a statement of identity, a simple, profound truth. I am not one of them. He was drawing a line not on the floor, but in the very fabric of the world, placing himself on one side and all her ghosts on the other. The fight went out of her. Her hands fell away from his chest. The terror, which had no real, present threat to sustain it, receded, leaving behind only the vast, empty landscape of her exhaustion. She went limp in his arms, her head falling against his shoulder. She was too sick, too tired to fight anymore. She could only trust the words. He carried her the few feet to a dusty straw tick mattress in the corner that she hadn't even noticed, a relic from the station's long-dead past. He laid her down gently, his movements careful and deliberate. He did not linger. He straightened up immediately, pulling the thick wool blanket she'd been using and spreading it over her. He then took his own neckerchief, dipped it in the pot of water which had cooled slightly, and wrung it out. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gently placed the damp, cool cloth on her burning forehead. The relief was instantaneous, a small anchor of comfort in the swirling chaos of the fever. Ilara's eyes fluttered closed. She was sinking, falling into a darkness that was deeper and more absolute than sleep. But it wasn't a frightening darkness. It was quiet. It was peaceful. The last thing she was aware of was the solid presence of the man settling back down by the fire, the quiet crackle of the flames, and the echo of his words in the silent spaces of her mind. "I'm not one of them." For the first time in weeks, she didn't fall into a shallow, haunted doze. She fell into a true, bottomless sleep, the kind that heals and mends, trusting that the man guarding the fire would keep the world, and all of its monsters, at bay. The awakening was unlike any she had known before. It was not a violent wrenching from a nightmare, nor a slow, cold surfacing into fear. It was a gentle unfurling, like a leaf turning toward the light. She came to awareness slowly, adrift in a quiet, gray space between sleep and consciousness. The first thing she registered was the absence of pain. The deep, burning ache in her bones had vanished, leaving behind a clean, hollowed-out feeling, a weakness that was calm and peaceful rather than agonizing. The second was the silence. The monstrous howl of the blizzard had passed, leaving a profound quiet in its wake, a world muffled and softened by a fresh blanket of snow. Her eyes opened. She did not move, did not even turn her head, but simply took in the scene from her low vantage on the straw mattress. The room was bathed in a soft, ethereal light. A single resolute beam of pale morning sun pierced through the grime of the small window, cutting a bright line through the dusty air and illuminating millions of tiny, dancing dust motes. The light was gentle, forgiving. It did not expose the room's squalor, but rather transformed it, softening the hard edges and painting the rough-hewn walls in shades of silver and gold. It was the light of a new day, a day that felt different from all the desperate, hopeless days that had come before it. Her gaze shifted to the hearth. He was there, Calder, already awake and tending to a small, well-behaved fire. His back was to her, a broad and solid shape against the warm glow. He was not the menacing silhouette of the first night, nor the stoic caregiver from the depths of her fever. In the quiet morning light, he was just a man mending a piece of his gear, his head bent in concentration, his hands moving with a practiced, unhurried skill. She could see the worn patch on the elbow of his shirt, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. These small, human details were disarming. They chipped away at the monstrous image of man that had been branded into her mind, replacing it with something quieter, something real. Then she smelled it. Beneath the familiar, clean scent of wood smoke was another aroma, something warm and wholesome. It was the smell of flour, of salt, of bread. It was faint, but it was the smell of life, of sustenance, and it spoke to the profound, aching emptiness in her stomach. Her body, finally free from the grip of fever, was reasserting its most basic needs. She lay there for a long time, simply watching him. She felt strangely safe, a feeling so foreign it was almost unsettling. Her fear, which had been her constant companion, the very air she breathed, had receded. It was not gone. She knew. It was a wary animal, hiding in the deep woods of her memory, ready to spring at the slightest provocation. But for now, in this quiet, sunlit moment, it was dormant. In its place was a vast and curious stillness. She was aware of the worn, rough texture of the straw tick beneath her, the comforting weight of the wool blanket over her, the steady, rhythmic sound of the man's breathing mixing with the soft crackle of the flames. Eventually, the need to move, to sit up and join the world of the living, became an undeniable urge. Slowly, testing her newfound strength, she pushed herself up. Her muscles felt weak and watery. but they obeyed her command. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the heavy blanket pooling in her lap. The small sound of her movement, the rustle of straw, was enough. Calder's hand stilled. He did not turn around quickly or with alarm, but with a slow, deliberate motion. He looked over his shoulder. His eyes met hers across the quiet room. It was a long moment, suspended in the sunlit, dusty air. This was not the brief, assessing glance of the first night, nor the focused, clinical gaze he'd worn while tending to her fever. This look was different. There was a question in his pale gray eyes, a quiet inquiry into her state. He was looking for a sign, for confirmation that the fever had truly passed. His face, usually a mask of stoicism, held a flicker of something she couldn't name, not concern, precisely, but a deep, settled attention. And her own gaze had changed. The wild, cornered animal terror was gone. She was no longer looking at him as a potential threat, a predator whose every move must be anticipated. She was simply looking at the man who had shared his fire, who had given her his blanket, who had nursed her through a fever without asking for a thing, who had told her, in a voice that cut through her panic, that he was not one of them. She held his gaze, and in that silent, shared look, she gave him her answer. "I am well." He seemed to understand. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. And then, as if the matter was settled, he turned back to the fire. The intensity of the moment passed, leaving behind a new and comfortable quiet. His turning away was not a dismissal. She realized it was an acceptance. It was an invitation. He was giving her the space to make her own choice, to approach or to stay where she was. For several minutes, she remained on the mattress, gathering her strength and her courage. The smell of the baking dough was stronger now, a magnetic pull. Finally, she stood up. Her legs were unsteady, and she had to place a hand against the wall to steady herself. But she did not falter. Taking a deep breath, she took a step, and then another, crossing the floor that had once been a starkly divided territory. She was leaving her side, her designated zone of safety, and willingly walking toward his. She stopped a few feet from the hearth, close enough to feel the full, glorious warmth of the fire on her face and arms. She did not speak. She simply stood and watched. He was working with a small mound of dough on a floured piece of canvas, with surprising dexterity. His large, calloused hands worked the simple mixture of flour and water, kneading it, dividing it, and shaping it into small, rough discs. A small cast-iron skillet sat on the embers, and a few finished flatbreads, golden brown and slightly charred in places, were already resting on a tin plate nearby. He did not acknowledge her presence with a look or a word, but she felt his awareness of her. He continued his work, his movements fluid and efficient. He placed another disk of dough onto the hot skillet, and it immediately began to sizzle and puff up, the sound a comforting counterpoint to the crackling fire. He knew she was there, and he was letting her be. A strange impulse rose in her, a desire to participate in this simple, life-affirming ritual. It was an instinct she thought had been beaten out of her, the desire to make, to help, to be useful. She watched his hands for a moment longer. Then, without thinking, she knelt down on the hearthstones opposite him. She reached out, her hand hovering hesitantly over the remaining mound of dough. Calder paused his work. He looked at her small, grimy hand, then up at her face. His expression was unreadable. She thought for a moment she had crossed a line, had presumed too much. Her courage faltered, and she started to pull her hand back. But then he did something unexpected. He took the floured canvas and pushed it gently across the hearthstones until it was in the space between them, a shared workspace. Then he went back to his task, leaving her to make the next move. Her heart gave a small, strange flutter. Tentatively, she reached out again and took a small piece of dough. It was soft and pliant in her hands. She began to mimic his movements, shaping the dough into a clumsy, uneven circle. Her hands were slow and awkward compared to his, but she focused on the task, on the feel of the dough, on the heat of the fire on her cheeks. They worked together in a comfortable, profound silence. The only sounds were the sizzle of the bread, the whisper of the flames, and the soft patting of their hands shaping the dough. They did not look at each other again, yet they were more connected in that moment than if they had been speaking. They were two people, brought together by a storm, performing the ancient and sacred task of making bread. A shared rhythm developed between them. She would shape a disc, and he would take it and place it on the skillet, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest of instants. The first time it happened, she flinched, an involuntary recoil born of memory, but his touch was impersonal, accidental, and he gave no sign that he had even noticed. The second time, she did not flinch. When all the dough was cooked, a small, precious stack of flatbreads sat on the tin plate. Calder took his knife and used the flat of the blade to nudge the plate away from the direct heat. He took 2 of the breads for himself. Then, he looked at the remaining stack, and with the tip of his knife, he separated a portion. He slid the tin plate across the smooth hearthstones until it stopped just in front of her. Her portion was bigger than his. Elara stared at the simple offering. 3 pieces of slightly burnt, irregularly shaped bread on a dented tin plate. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was more than just food. It was a gesture of profound and simple kindness. He was sharing what little he had, and he had given her the larger share. It was an acknowledgement of her weakness, of her recovery, of her need. It was an act of provision, freely given, with no expectation of payment or reward. A hot, painful lump formed in her throat. For weeks, her body had been a commodity, her worth measured by what could be taken from her. To be given something, to be cared for, to be seen as a person deserving of the bigger portion, it was an idea so foreign, so overwhelming. It shattered the fragile dam of her control. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Then another followed. She did not make a sound, did not sob or cry out. She simply sat there as silent tears streamed down her face, mourning for the person she had been and overwhelmed by the simple, unexpected grace of this moment. She reached for a piece of the bread. It was still warm. She lifted it to her lips and took a bite. It tasted of flour, of fire, and of salt, and to Elara, it was the taste of hope. She ate slowly, savoring every mouthful, as the silent tears continued to fall. Across the fire, Calder ate his own portion, his gaze fixed on the flames, giving her the gift of his silence, allowing her the space to feel the strange, painful, and beautiful dawn of gratitude. The flatbread was gone, but the warmth it had created in her belly remained, a small, solid anchor in the vast sea of her uncertainty. They sat for a long time in the quiet aftermath of the meal, the silence between them no longer a tense, watchful thing, but a shared space of rest. Outside, the world was blindingly white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape scoured clean and remade in alabaster and diamonds. The sun, climbing higher in a sky of impossible blue, reflected off the snow with a brilliance that made the interior of the station seem even more like a dim, quiet cave. The new day brought with it an unspoken question that hung in the air between them. What now? The station had been a temporary haven, a shared sanctuary from the blizzard. But the storm was over. The world had opened up again. Soon, they would have to leave this place. Calder would go his way. And she would have to go hers. The thought sent a sliver of the old, familiar ice sliding back into her veins. There was no her way. There was only the vast, empty snow and the certainty that somewhere, out there, men were still looking for her. Calder seemed to sense the shift in her mood. He broke the long silence, his voice the same low, steady rumble as before, startling her not with its volume but with its very presence. "The snow will make for hard travel," he said, not to her, but to the fire, as if stating a simple, immutable fact. but it's better to be moving. He began to gather his few belongings with methodical purpose. He rolled his canvas bedroll, his movements precise and economical. He cleaned the small skillet with a handful of snow, tucking it and the tin plate back into his saddlebags. He was preparing to leave her. Each efficient motion was a tick of a clock, counting down the last moments of her fragile safety. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in her throat. She had to say something. She couldn't just let him walk out that door and leave her to the silence, to the cold, to whatever might be waiting for her beyond these walls. But what could she say? What right did she have to ask anything of him? He had already given her more than she could have ever expected. He had given her warmth, food, and a night free from terror. He owed her nothing more. He stood up, shrugging on his heavy duster coat. He looked taller now, his frame once again filling the small space. He walked to the door and gave the splintered wood a heavy shove, testing its integrity. It held. He looked back at her, his pale eyes meeting hers. It was a final, questioning look, a silent farewell. The words tumbled out of her before she could stop them. A desperate, ragged plea. "My name is Claire." It was a foolish, nonsensical thing to say, but it was the only thing she had to offer him, the only piece of herself that was truly hers. Calder paused, his hand on the broken door. He did not seem surprised. He simply waited, his gaze steady, allowing her the space to continue. His silence was an invitation, a quiet command to say what needed to be said. Taking a shaky breath, she began to speak, her voice low and unsteady, the words sticking in her throat. I ran away 2 weeks ago." She stared at her hands, twisting a loose thread on the wool blanket that still lay across her lap. She couldn't bear to look at his face, afraid of what she might see there. Pity, disgust, disbelief. "There was a man," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "His name was Silas. He was a trader. He came through our town, buying furs." She swallowed hard, the memory a bitter taste in her mouth. "My father, he owed people money. He was a weak man. He liked to drink and gamble more than he liked to work." She stopped, the shame of it a hot flush on her cheeks. She had never spoken these words aloud to anyone. They had been a secret, poisoned well inside her. To give them voice felt like a betrayal, and yet a profound relief. Calder did not move. He did not speak. He simply stood by the door, a silent sentinel. His presence a solid wall she could lean her fragile words against. His stillness gave her the courage to go on. "Silas saw me. He talked to my father, offered him a price." The word came out choked and ugly. Price, as if she were a horse or a bolt of cloth. "My father took the money. Silas said he would take me with him when he left in the morning. Said he'd give me a good life in the city, a new dress. He said I would want for nothing." She gave a small, humorless laugh that sounded more like a sob. I knew what he meant. I knew the kind of life he was offering. I'd seen other girls in town, girls who'd been bought. They had pretty dresses, for a while. Then they just faded. I packed a small bag, some bread, a worn-out shawl, and I ran. I ran that night. She fell silent again, the story hanging in the air. She had expected him to ask questions. Where was she from? What did this Silas look like? Where was her father now? These were the questions any normal person would ask. They were the questions that would require her to give up more pieces of herself, to expose more of her wounds to the cold air. But Calder asked nothing. He remained silent, his gaze unwavering, his face unreadable. He did not pry. He did not probe. He simply listened. He accepted her story as it was given, a complete and contained thing, a heavy stone she had finally been allowed to set down. His silence was not a lack of interest. It was a form of respect. He was respecting the privacy of her pain, allowing her to keep its ugliest details for herself. Finally, she dared to lift her head and look at him. His face was etched with the same profound weariness she had first seen, but there was no judgment in his eyes. There was only a quiet, deep-seeing stillness. He had heard her story, and he was still here. He hadn't turned away in disgust. He hadn't dismissed her. He had simply heard her. "They've been hunting me," she whispered, the last piece of the truth. "His men, they are not good people. I think the storm was the only reason I got away." Now there was nothing left to say. Her past, her present, her terror, it was all laid bare in the quiet, sunlit room. He knew who she was, a runaway, a piece of property, a girl with a price on her head. He knew that to associate with her was to invite trouble, to step into the shadow that followed her relentlessly. He pulled his hat down low on his brow, a gesture of finality. He was going to leave. She knew it. He had to. It was the only sensible thing to do. She braced herself for the sight of his back as he walked out the door, for the return of the crushing, absolute loneliness. But he didn't move toward the exit. He looked at her, his pale eyes holding hers, and for the first time, he spoke her name. It sounded strange in his rough voice, but also real, solid. "Claire," he said, and then he waited. The final, desperate truth rose up in her, the culmination of all her fear and all her hope. She looked around the squalid little room, the cold hearth, the broken furniture, the dust of ages, and then she looked at him, this silent, stoic stranger who had become her only anchor in the world. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said, her voice small but clear, stripped of all artifice. It was not a plea, not a demand. It was a simple, devastating statement of fact. Her journey had ended here, in this abandoned place. Beyond its broken door lay a world that held no safety for her, no home, no future. Calder held her gaze for a long moment. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of her confession and the gravity of his impending decision. The sunbeam crawling across the floor seemed to stop, holding its breath. He looked from her face to the vast, white world beyond the door, and then back again. His jaw was tight, the muscles working under his beard. He was weighing the risks, calculating the cost of her words. To take her with him was to take on her trouble as his own. It was a heavy burden for any man to bear, let alone a stranger. She expected him to shake his head, to murmur an apology, to tell her he couldn't help her. She expected him to turn and walk away, and she knew, with a terrible certainty, that she couldn't blame him if he did. But he did not walk away. He gave a short, sharp nod, as if coming to a decision that had already been made long ago. "My place isn't much," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But it's safe. The roof leaks, and the wind gets in. But no one will find you there." He turned and pushed the door open. Bright, cold light flooded the room. He stepped outside, then looked back at her. "Come on," he said. "It's a long ride." And just like that, he had made his choice. He had chosen to shoulder her burden. He had chosen to offer her not just a meal or a blanket, but a sanctuary. Relief, so powerful and so overwhelming it made her knees weak, washed through Claire. She stood up, leaving the warm wool blanket, her last tie to this place, folded neatly on the straw mattress. She had nothing to take with her but the worn dress on her back and the fragile, burgeoning hope this man had given her. She walked across the room and stepped out of the darkness of the station into the brilliant, blinding light of the snow-covered world, following the silent man who had offered her a place to go. The journey to Calder's home was a long, silent passage through a world of white. His horse, a sturdy, dark beast, plowed through the deep snow with weary determination, while Claire followed in its wake, her own steps falling into the path he forged. The vast, unending landscape was both terrifying and beautiful. There were no roads, no fences, no sign of human life, only the rolling plains, the distant, tooth-like mountains, and a sky so wide and empty it seemed to press down on the soul. It was a harsh, unforgiving land, but walking behind Calder's solid, unyielding form, Claire felt a sense of security that was entirely new to her. He was a landmark in the wilderness, a guarantee of direction. His ranch was not so much a place as it was a scar of human will upon the face of the plains. It consisted of a small, brutally simple cabin built of thick, dark logs, a larger, more solidly constructed barn, and a series of corrals, their fences like skeletal fingers against the snow. There was no garden, no porch swing, no touch of softness anywhere. It was a place built for survival, not for comfort, and it was a perfect reflection of the man who inhabited it. He led her into the cabin. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone hearth that was clearly the heart of the home. A crude wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, and shelves holding a few tin plates, sacks of flour and beans, and other basic provisions lined another. It was sparse, almost monastic, but it was immaculately clean. The floorboards were swept bare, the tools by the hearth were oiled and ordered, and there was no clutter, no waste. Calder gestured to the cot. "You can sleep here," he said. Then he turned, pulled on a pair of work gloves, and went back outside, leaving her alone in the quiet space that was to be her new home. The first few days passed in a state of awkward, watchful silence. Claire, terrified of being a burden, of overstaying a welcome that had never been formally extended, tried to make herself useful. She found an old but sturdy broom behind the door and swept the floor, not because it was dirty, but because the simple, repetitive motion was a comfort, an act of purpose. She learned the rhythm of the cabin the way the morning light first hit the far wall, the specific creak of the 3rd floorboard from the door, the low whistle the wind made when it came from the north. She kept the fire fed and a pot of water always hot on the hearth. Calder, for his part, seemed to take her presence as a simple fact, like a change in the weather. He never told her what to do, nor did he thank her for the small tasks she took upon herself. He would leave before dawn, a silent shadow moving out into the vast, cold darkness to tend to his cattle. He would return long after the sun had set, his face etched with weariness, his clothes smelling of cold air and livestock. He would eat the simple meal she had prepared, usually some kind of stew made from beans and dried meat, and then sit by the fire, cleaning his rifle or sharpening a knife, his silence as deep and vast as the plains outside. Their communication was a language of gestures, a silent conversation built from small, practical deeds. One morning, she awoke to find a stack of firewood, cut smaller than his usual logs, left just inside the door, perfect for the cabin's hearth. She never mentioned it, but she made sure a bucket of hot water was waiting for him when he came in that evening, so he could wash the grime of the day from his hands and face. He began leaving a portion of his morning coffee simmering by the fire for her. She, in turn, found a torn seam in one of his wool shirts and mended it with a needle and thread from her own small, hidden pouch, leaving the repaired shirt folded neatly on his bedroll. Neither of them ever said, "Thank you." The words would have felt loud and clumsy, an intrusion on the quiet understanding they were building. Their gratitude was expressed not in language, but in action. It was in the anticipation of a need, the quiet provision for a small comfort. It was a trust being built not on promises, but on the steady, reliable evidence of mutual care. One afternoon, he came back from the barn carrying a broken saddle. The leather stitching on the fender split and frayed. He sat on the floor by the fire and began to work, his tools laid out on a piece of canvas. Claire watched him, her hands idle in her lap. She knew nothing of leather work, but she was drawn to the focused intensity of his labor. His large hands, which she had once feared, moved with a surprising grace and precision, pushing the thick awl through the tough leather, threading the waxed string in its wake. He seemed to feel her gaze upon him. Without looking up, he gestured with his chin toward a second awl. "Hold this," he said. "Keep the hole open." She knelt beside him, her heart thumping a little faster. She took the tool, its wooden handle smooth and worn from use, and did as he instructed, pressing the point into the hole he had just made. He worked the needle and thread through, his knuckles brushing against hers. She flinched, but only slightly. He pulled the stitch tight, the leather groaning in protest. "Again," he murmured, punching a new hole. They worked like that for over an hour, falling into a shared, silent rhythm. He would pierce the leather, and she would hold the hole, their hands working in concert. He was teaching her, she realized, not with words, but by making her a part of the process. He was showing her how to mend what was broken. She could feel the heat from his shoulder, could smell the faint scent of leather and oil and clean sweat. She was closer to him than she had ever been, and for the first time, it did not feel threatening. It felt solid, like they were two parts of a single machine, working together against the slow decay of the world. His trust in her grew in other ways. A few days later, he led her to the barn. The place was warm and alive, smelling richly of hay and horses. His horse, the dark, steady beast from their journey, watched them with intelligent, liquid eyes. Calder spoke to the animal in a low, soothing murmur, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He showed her the grain bin, how to measure out the proper portion of oats. "Hold your hand flat," he instructed, his voice quiet so as not to spook the animal. "Like this. Let him come to you. Don't ever approach a horse from behind." She did as he said, her hand trembling as she held out the grain. The horse lowered its massive head, its velvety nose snuffling against her palm, its warm breath ghosting across her skin. It lipped the oats from her hand with a gentleness that was shocking in such a powerful creature. A small, involuntary smile touched Claire's lips. It was the first time she had smiled in months, and the feeling was so unfamiliar it was like a muscle she had forgotten how to use. Calder saw it. He didn't smile back, but the hard lines around his eyes seemed to soften for just a moment before he turned away to fork fresh hay into the stall. Weeks turned into a month. The deep snows began to melt under the strengthening sun, revealing the pale, sleeping grasses of the plains beneath. Life settled into a routine that was predictable and, therefore, safe. Claire felt the tight, watchful knot in her soul begin to loosen. The nightmares came less frequently. She no longer jumped at every unexpected sound. She was beginning to heal. One warm afternoon, while Calder was out checking on a distant herd, she found herself wandering further from the cabin than she ever had before. In a sheltered hollow, where the last of the snowmelt collected, she found a splash of impossible color against the drab brown of the awakening prairie, a small, defiant patch of wildflowers. They were not delicate, hothouse blooms, but tough, hardy things, the fiery red of Indian paintbrush and the deep, resilient purple of prairie verbena. They were beautiful, but it was their tenacity she admired. They were survivors, just like her. On impulse, she began to pick them, gathering a small, vibrant bouquet in her hands. She brought them back to the cabin, the bright colors a stark contrast to the muted tones of her world. She wanted to put them on the table, to bring this small piece of life and beauty inside, but the gesture felt too bold, too presumptuous. It felt like claiming a space that was not yet hers to claim. Instead, she left them on the rough-hewn railing of the small porch, a simple, anonymous offering to the cabin itself. She went inside, her heart beating with a strange anxiety. What would he think? Would he see it as a foolish, womanly sentiment? Would he simply ignore it? Or worse, sweep the flowers to the ground as useless clutter? When he rode in at dusk, he was silhouetted against a spectacular, bruised purple sunset. He swung down from his horse, his movements weary. As he approached the cabin, he saw the small, bright bouquet. He stopped. He stood there for a long moment, his head tilted slightly, just looking at the splash of color. Claire watched him from the shadows of the window, her breath held tight in her chest. He did not touch them. He simply looked, then continued on into the cabin without a word, his face as unreadable as ever. Claire's heart sank. It was foolish, a waste of time. She went to bed that night with a familiar ache of disappointment in her chest. She had tried to offer something soft in this hard place, and it had been passed over. But when she awoke the next morning, the first thing she saw stopped her breath. There, in the center of the crude wooden table, was her small bouquet of wildflowers. They were standing in a cracked earthenware water jug, the only vessel in the house that could possibly serve as a vase. The morning sun streamed through the window and set the colors ablaze, a beacon of vibrant life in the simple, quiet room. He had seen her offering, and in his own silent, deliberate way, he had accepted it. He had brought it inside. He had given it a place of honor. He had taken the small, fragile piece of beauty she had offered and made it the center of their home. Claire stood in the quiet cabin, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. She looked at the flowers, then at the closed door behind which Calder had already disappeared into the dawn. No words had been spoken. None were needed. The change in the weather was a betrayal. The fragile, hopeful spring that had begun to soften the edges of the land was clawed back by a sudden, vicious return to winter. It came not with a clean, quiet blanket of snow, but with a storm of freezing rain and a wind that shrieked like something wounded. For 2 days, it assaulted the small cabin, turning the world outside into a churning, gray misery. The sturdy log walls held, but the constant, percussive drumming of icy rain against the roof was a relentless assault on the quiet peace Claire had come to cherish. On the second night, the storm found a weakness. It started as a small, irregular sound, almost lost in the roar of the wind, a faint plink, plink, plink. Claire, lying on her narrow cot, tried to ignore it, but the sound grew more insistent, more rhythmic, until it became a steady, maddening drip. A cold, wet spot began to grow on her thin blanket, directly over her legs. She shifted, pulling her knees to her chest, but the leak was persistent. A slow, icy trickle of water found its way through a new crack in the roof's sod, a single, cold tear from the weeping sky. Soon, the spot was no longer damp, but soaked. The chill of it seeped through the blanket and the thin straw mattress, touching her skin with a cold that felt personal and invasive. Defeated. She threw the sodden blanket aside and rose from the cot. The floorboards were frigid under her bare feet. There was nowhere else for her to sleep. The small cabin had only 2 designated places for rest: Calder's bedroll by the fire, and her own cot, which was now uninhabitable. She retreated to the driest corner she could find, wrapping her arms around herself and sinking to the floor. She pressed her back against the solid logs, hoping to draw some insulation from the thick wood. But the cold was relentless. It crept up from the floor, a damp, penetrating chill that found its way into her bones. The shivering started again, not the violent, feverish shaking she had endured before, but a low, grinding tremor of pure cold that exhausted her muscles and rattled her teeth. The familiar sensation brought with it a familiar dread. She was once again the girl in the corner, cold, alone, and vulnerable. The weeks of quiet routine, of mended saddles and shared bread, of wildflowers in a jug, all the small, carefully laid stones of her new security felt as if they were being washed away by this relentless, invading cold. The cabin, which had become a sanctuary, now felt like a trap, its single room shrinking around her. Across the room, Calder was a long, still shape in his bedroll, bathed in the warm, flickering light of the hearth. She had thought he was asleep, but as a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the door, she saw him shift. He sat up, his movements economical even when rising from sleep. He looked at the fire, his expression thoughtful. Then his gaze moved through the shadowed room and found her, a small, huddled shape in the corner. He saw her shivering, heard the steady, accusing drip of water onto her abandoned cot. He didn't need to ask what was wrong. The storm had breached their fortress. He rose to his feet, a tall silhouette against the flames. He took several heavy logs from the woodpile and placed them carefully onto the fire. The flames leaped up, a roaring, hungry beast, throwing a wave of intense heat into the room and casting wild, dancing shadows on the walls. It was a good fire, a powerful fire, but its warmth was a small island in the vast, cold ocean of the cabin. It could not reach her corner. The cold from the floor was a more powerful enemy. Calder stood by the hearth, watching her. He knew the fire wasn't enough. His gaze went from her shivering form to the empty space beside him on his thick bedroll, the warmest, driest spot in the entire world. The offer was there, hanging in the air between them, as clear and sharp as the sound of the freezing rain on the roof. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Her mind screamed, "No, never, not that." Her body, however, screamed something else entirely. It screamed for warmth, for an end to the punishing cold, for the simple animal comfort of a dry place to lie down. A terrible, silent war raged within her. To accept his unspoken invitation was to cross a line she had sworn to herself she would never, ever cross. To share a bed with a man, the very thought brought a cold sweat to her skin that had nothing to do with the leaking roof. It brought back the suffocating smell of stale whiskey, the feeling of a heavy weight pressing down on her, the memory of fighting until she had no fight left. But to refuse was to condemn herself to a night of freezing misery, to huddle in a corner until she was numb and sick. She looked at Calder, his face half in shadow, half illuminated by the firelight. This was the man who had given her his blanket, who had nursed her through a fever, who had accepted her past without judgment and her presence without question. This was the man who had put her wildflowers in a jug. He saw the violent conflict in her eyes. He must have seen the terror that was winning the battle. He spoke, his voice a low rumble, barely audible over the storm. "You'll be sick again by morning if you stay there." His words, practical and devoid of emotion, were a statement of fact, not a plea, but they forced the issue. They required an answer. "I can't," she whispered, the words torn from her throat. She hugged her knees tighter, making herself smaller. "I can't." He took a step away from the fire, not towards her, but into the center of the room, closing the distance just enough so he wouldn't have to raise his voice. "The floor is cold, Claire, and that corner is a long way from the fire." "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. She finally gave voice to the heart of her terror, a confession that cost her more than any other. I have never slept beside a man." She squeezed her eyes shut, shame and fear washing over her in a sickening wave. "I can't." He was silent for a long moment. She expected him to turn away, to leave her to her foolish, hysterical fears. It was a reasonable request, to be left alone. But when he spoke again, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it, stripped of its usual gruffness. It was a quiet, deliberate sound, meant to soothe, not to command. "We would just be sleeping," he said. "There is a storm, and the roof is leaking. We are two people trying to stay warm. It is nothing more than that." He walked back to his bedroll. He didn't look at her. He lay down, and then he did the thing that shattered her resolve. He reached over and took the edge of his thick wool blanket, the one he had given to her that first night in the stagecoach station, and he folded it back. He lifted the corner, creating an open, empty space beside him, an invitation, a sanctuary. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and steady in the firelight. He saw the terror still warring on her face, and he murmured, his voice a low, factual statement that somehow held all the reassurance in the world. "You are now." It wasn't a command. It was a gentle reframing of reality. The impossible thing was happening, and he was making it possible. He was telling her that this moment, with him, was different. This would not be like the other times. This was something new. For a long, agonizing minute, she remained frozen. The choice before her, a chasm. On one side was the familiar, punishing cold. On the other, a terrifying leap into the unknown. Taking a shuddering breath that felt like a sob, she made her choice. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she rose. Every muscle in her body was screaming in protest, in rebellion. She crossed the floor, each step a monumental effort of will. She reached the edge of his bedroll and hesitated, her entire being vibrating with a high-frequency hum of pure dread. She slid under the blanket, moving as far to the edge of the bedroll as she could without falling off. She immediately turned her back to him, curling into a tight, defensive ball. Her body was rigid, a solid block of petrified tension. She waited, her ears straining, every nerve ending on fire. She waited for his arm to come around her, for his weight to shift, for his breath on her neck. She waited for the inevitable violation that her mind and body were braced for. But nothing happened. Calder did not move. He lay as still as the stones in the hearth. He did not shift his weight. He did not sigh. He did not adjust his position. He kept his body carefully on his side of the bedroll, maintaining a small but significant gap between them. He breathed slowly, evenly. He made himself as unobtrusive as a shadow, a simple source of heat in the cold night. The storm raged on outside, a wild and furious symphony. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the quiet, steady rhythm of Calder's breathing. Claire lay awake, her eyes wide open in the darkness, her body still a taut wire of fear. But as the minutes bled into an hour, and then another, and he remained utterly, completely still, the rigid knot of terror in her stomach began to loosen, fiber by painful fiber. His stillness was not an accident. It was a choice. It was a conscious, deliberate act of will. He was guarding her peace. He was honoring her fear. He was holding himself as still as death so that she could feel, perhaps for the first time in her life, completely and absolutely safe in the presence of a man. She did not sleep, not truly, but sometime in the deep, dark hours before the dawn. As the storm began to wear itself out, her muscles finally relaxed, the shivering stopped, and she rested, adrift in the profound warmth of the fire, the blanket, and the silent, unwavering honor of the man beside her. She woke to a world remade. The wind was gone, its furious voice silenced. In its place was a profound, holy quiet, the kind that only follows a great storm. The light that filtered into the cabin was soft and gray, a diffuse glow that promised a slow and gentle dawn. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. She was warm, deeply and completely warm, a sensation so foreign and luxurious that it felt like a dream. Then memory returned, sharp and sudden, and her eyes flew open. She was in his bedroll. Calder lay beside her, his back to her, a still and solid presence in the dim light. The small gap he had so carefully maintained the night before had closed in their sleep. Her shoulder was just inches from his, and the warmth radiating from his body was a tangible, living thing. She had spent the entire night beside him, and she had survived, more than survived. She had rested, truly rested, in a way she hadn't since she'd fled her father's house. He was still asleep. His breathing was a low, even rhythm, the sound of a body at peace. In the weeks she had known him, she had only ever seen him awake, watchful, his face a mask of stoic endurance. To see him now, unguarded in sleep, was to see a different man entirely. The hard lines of his face were softened. The weariness that seemed carved into his features had smoothed away. He looked younger, more vulnerable. He was not the unassailable mountain of a man who had faced down the blizzard. He was just a man, sleeping. A strange, protective instinct stirred in her, something she had never felt before. She wanted to preserve this moment, to guard his peace as he had guarded hers, carefully, moving with an excruciating slowness. She began to inch her way out from under the heavy blanket. She held her breath, her muscles tense, expecting him to stir at any moment, but he remained lost in his sleep. She slid free, her bare feet meeting the cold floorboards with a silent gasp. She stood for a moment in the frigid air, looking down at him, the heavy wool blanket now covering only him. She felt a brief, irrational urge to pull it more snugly around his shoulders. But she resisted. It was too soon for such things. The cabin was a wreck. A large, dark puddle had formed on the floor beneath the leak, and her cot and mattress were soaked through. But the fire in the hearth was a bed of deep, glowing embers. Another small, considerate act he must have performed in the night to ensure the cabin would not be completely cold by morning. She added a few small pieces of kindling, coaxing the embers back to life until a small, cheerful flame began to dance. The dawn came slowly, filling the cabin with its pale, clean light. Outside, the world sparkled, every surface, every branch, every fence post. The very ground itself was encased in a perfect, clear sheath of ice. It was a world made of glass, beautiful and treacherous. She found a basin and a piece of coarse soap, and, taking it to the open doorway, she began to wash. The water, scooped from a rain barrel, was achingly cold, but it felt good to scrub the grime and the lingering scent of fear and sickness from her skin. She washed her face, her hands, her arms, the icy water a sharp and welcome shock that made her feel fully, vibrantly alive. She was focused on the task, on the simple, grounding sensation of the cold water, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up, her heart giving a small jolt. Calder was standing just inside the doorway, watching her. He was dressed, his hair still tousled from sleep. His face was unreadable, as always, but his eyes were clear and direct. He held a small, folded piece of cloth in his hand. It was clean, dry, and woven from a softer material than anything else in the cabin. He didn't speak. He simply stepped forward, his boots silent on the damp floor, and placed the towel on a dry spot on the porch railing beside her. Then he stepped back, his gaze never leaving her face. It was such a small thing, a towel, but in the silent language they had built, it was a paragraph, a chapter. It was the continuation of the night before. It was an acknowledgement of their shared space, a gesture of quiet, domestic care. It was him seeing a need and providing for it, simply and without fanfare. Claire looked from the towel to his face. The fear that had been her shadow for so long was gone, burned away by the long, safe night. In its place was something new, something warm and bright and fragile. A genuine smile touched her lips, not the small, hesitant curving of her mouth she had managed before, but a real smile, one that reached her eyes and lit them from within. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling both inadequate and momentous. And then she did something even bolder, as he began to turn away, to give her the privacy he always afforded her. She reached out and laid her hand on his forearm. It was the first time she had initiated contact. Her fingers were cold and wet. His arm, through the thick wool of his shirt, was solid and warm. The contrast was a small, electric shock. They both froze. For a single, suspended heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. She could feel the hard muscle under her fingertips, the steady, living pulse in his veins. She had expected to feel a flinch, a recoiling from her touch, either from him or from herself. It was what she knew. Contact was a prelude to pain. But this time, no one pulled back. He did not move a muscle, but she felt a change in him, a subtle shift in the tension of his body. He was not just allowing the contact, he was accepting it, and she, in turn, did not snatch her hand away as if she'd been burned. She let her fingers rest there, a silent, grateful pressure. It was a touch that said everything they could not speak. "I see you. I trust you. I am not afraid." After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, She slowly withdrew her hand. Calder gave a single, slow nod, his eyes dark and serious. Then he turned and went back into the cabin, leaving her with the clean towel and the lingering warmth of his skin under her fingertips. The rest of the morning passed in a new kind of quiet. It was no longer the silence of caution and uncertainty, but a silence of deep, shared understanding. The unspoken had finally been acknowledged. A barrier had been crossed. A wall crumbled into dust. They moved around the small cabin, preparing a simple breakfast, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken choreography. They were no longer two strangers sharing a space, but two people inhabiting a home. After they had eaten, Calder went to the barn. Claire watched him from the doorway, a strange restlessness stirring in her. She did not want to be left behind. She pulled on the sturdy boots he had found for her, a boy's cast-offs that were a little too big but blessedly warm and dry, and followed him. He was standing in the center of the barn, currying his horse. The animal stood patiently, its dark coat gleaming in the dusty shafts of light slanting through the gaps in the walls. "The stream will be high," Calder said, not looking at her. "He'll need water." It was an explanation, but it was also an invitation. Claire walked over and stood beside the horse, running her hand along its powerful, warm neck. The animal nickered softly and leaned into her touch. Calder finished his grooming and attached a lead rope to the horse's halter. He held the end of the rope for a moment. Then, without a word, he offered it to her. Claire looked at him, surprised. He was entrusting her with his animal, his most valuable possession besides his rifle. It was a profound gesture of trust. She took the rope, its worn leather soft in her hand. They walked out of the barn and into the glittering post-storm world. Calder walked on one side of the horse, she on the other. They moved in perfect step, a small, silent procession making its way across the icy ground. The air was cold and clean, smelling of wet earth and melting ice. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots, the horse's soft snorts, and the steady dripping of water from the eaves of the barn. The stream was, as he'd predicted, a rushing, turbulent torrent of gray-brown water, swollen with melted snow and rain. They led the horse to a calmer spot along the bank where it could drink its fill. As the animal drank, they stood side by side, not speaking, simply watching the water hurry past. The world felt quiet, peaceful, full of a new and fragile hope. The journey back to the cabin was slow. The ice was beginning to melt, turning the ground into a slick, treacherous mud. Claire found her footing slipping several times, her oversized boots struggling for purchase. Calder's hand would shoot out, his fingers closing around her elbow to steady her, his touch firm and impersonal, withdrawing as soon as she was stable. They were halfway back to the barn when her foot slid violently on a hidden patch of ice. She stumbled, her arms pinwheeling for balance. Calder's hand caught her again, stronger this time, pulling her back from the fall. But this time, when she had regained her footing, he did not immediately let go. His fingers remained wrapped around her arm, his thumb resting in the sensitive crook of her elbow. They stood there, tethered by his grip, the horse waiting patiently beside them. She could feel the warmth of his hand through her thin shirt, a warmth that seemed to spread up her arm and into her chest. She looked up at him. His face was close, his pale eyes searching hers. The world seemed to narrow to the few inches of space between them. This was it, another choice, another chasm to cross. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but it was not a frantic, fearful rhythm. It was a strong, steady beat. The fear was gone. She had spent a lifetime being taken from, her touch something to be stolen or bought. Now, she wanted to give. She wanted to choose. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her free hand. She did not look at his face, but at their joined arms, with a courage that seemed to come from a place deep inside her she hadn't known existed. She reached out and curled her fingers around his. Her hand was small in his large, calloused one. It was a tentative, questioning gesture. Calder's breath hitched, a small, sharp sound in the quiet air. She felt his entire body go still. She waited, her heart in her throat, for him to pull away, to reject this bold, unprecedented advance. He did not pull away. Instead, after a long, silent moment, she felt his fingers slowly, deliberately, close around hers. It was not a possessive grip, not a confining one. It was a gentle, encompassing pressure, his hand molding itself to hers as if it were made to be there. He said nothing. He didn't need to. In that single, quiet action, he answered every question she had ever had. He squeezed her hand, a gentle, reassuring pressure, and Claire, for the first time in a lifetime, squeezed back, and together, hand in hand, they led the horse home. The days that followed were a quiet revelation. The simple act of holding hands had changed the very air in the cabin, charging it with a new and unspoken intimacy. The silence between them was no longer a space to be carefully navigated, but a comfortable blanket they shared. They worked, they ate, they lived in a rhythm that was as natural and steady as a heartbeat. The fear that had been the foundation of Claire's world had been replaced by something so fragile and yet so powerful she hardly dared to name it. It felt like hope. They were mending a section of corral fence under the pale afternoon sun. The air was cool, but held the promise of genuine warmth, the smell of damp earth and budding cottonwood trees. Claire worked beside Calder, handing him tools, holding posts steady while he tamped the earth around them. She had grown stronger in her time here. The hollows in her cheeks had filled out, and the work had brought a wiry strength to her arms and a healthy color to her face. She was no longer a ghost haunting the corners of a room, but a woman standing in the sun, her hands calloused, her gaze clear. It was Calder who saw it first. He was sighting along a fence line, his body still, his focus absolute. When his head came up, he froze, his gaze fixed on the far horizon, a single, dark speck against the vast, pale blue of the sky. Claire, seeing the sudden, hawk-like stillness in him, followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing but the endless sweep of the plains. Then she saw it too, a rider, a lone figure, moving steadily, relentlessly, toward them. A cold fist closed around her heart. Visitors were not a feature of this isolated life. In all her time here, they had not seen another soul. A stranger was an anomaly, and an anomaly was a threat. "Maybe it's just a traveler," she said, her voice a little too high, a little too thin. "Lost." Calder did not take his eyes off the rider. He said nothing, but she saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. He knew, with the primal instinct of a man who lived by his wits and his senses, that this was not a lost traveler. This was a man with a purpose. This was a man who was hunting. They stood in silence, two statues in the vast emptiness, and watched the speck grow larger. It resolved itself into a man on a lean, wiry horse, a horse bred for endurance, not for speed. The man rode with a lazy, arrogant slump, a posture that radiated a cruel confidence. As he drew closer, the details of his face began to emerge from the distance. A heavy jaw, a wide, thin-lipped mouth, a hat pulled low against the sun, and as he came closer still, a sickening, paralyzing wave of recognition washed over Claire. It was not Silas, the man who had bought her. It was worse. It was Jonas, Silas's right-hand man, the one whose eyes had always lingered on her with a particular, greasy possessiveness, the one whose laughter had been the cruelest. The blood drained from her face. The hammer she was holding slipped from her nerveless fingers and fell to the dirt with a soft thud. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. The world seemed to tilt, the horizon blurring. He had found her. The ghost from her past had ridden into her present and was about to burn her fragile future to the ground. "Claire." Calder's voice cut through the fog of her panic. It was low, sharp, and absolute. A command. "Go to the house," he said. his eyes still locked on the approaching rider. "Bar the door! Stay away from the window!" It was the only logical thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. It was what the old Claire, the terrified, hunted girl, would have done without a second's hesitation. She would have run. She would have hidden. She would have prayed for deliverance. Her feet even made a small, involuntary movement toward the cabin, her body obeying the deep-seated instinct to flee. But she stopped. She looked at Calder's rigid back, at the way his hand had fallen to rest, loose but ready, on the Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip. She looked at the small, sturdy cabin, at the wildflowers, now faded, still in their jug on the table inside. She looked at the corral they had just been mending, at the solid, tangible evidence of the life they were building, post by post, nail by nail. And she thought, no. Running had been her survival. It had gotten her here. But this place, this man, this quiet, simple life, this was no longer just a place to survive. This was a place to live. And she would not be run out of her own life. To run now would be to admit that she was still Silas's property. It would be to say that this peace, this fragile hope, was not truly hers to have. To run now would be to abandon the one person in the world who had shown her what it meant to be safe. A new feeling, hot and fierce, surged through her, burning away the cold tendrils of fear. It was anger, a deep, righteous anger at this man who dared to ride into her sanctuary, who dared to threaten the one good thing she had ever known. "No," she said, her voice quiet but as hard as forged steel. Calder turned his head, his pale eyes wide with surprise. "Claire, this is not a discussion. Get in the house." "This is my fight, too," she said, her gaze fixed on Jonas, who was now close enough for her to see the cruel smirk on his face. "He's not here for you. He's here for me. I'm done running." For a moment, she thought he would argue, that he would grab her and physically force her into the safety of the cabin. But he looked at her, truly looked at her, and he saw the change. He saw that the terrified girl he had found in the stagecoach station was gone. In her place stood a woman, her jaw set, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. He saw her resolve, and he respected it. He gave a single sharp nod. "All right," he said. "The shotgun is by the door. Loaded." Jonas reined in his horse about 30 yards from them, the animal dancing nervously. He leaned forward on his saddle horn, his smirk widening into a grin that was all teeth. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Look what I found. The little runaway bird. Silas is going to be mighty pleased with me. He's missed his investment." Claire walked, her legs steady, toward the cabin. She did not run. She moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace that she did not know she possessed. Jonas's eyes followed her, a hungry, possessive look. He thought she was retreating. She reached the porch, her hand closing around the cold, smooth wood of the shotgun that was leaning against the wall, exactly where Calder had said it would be. The weapon was heavy, heavier than she'd imagined, and its cold reality was a comfort. She checked the breech, her movements clumsy but certain. Both barrels were loaded. She turned and stood in the doorway of the cabin, the shotgun held at her side, its twin muzzles pointed at the ground. She was not hiding behind the door, she was guarding it. Jonas's grin faltered. This was not the reaction he had expected. He had expected tears, pleading, a panicked flight. He had not expected this cold, quiet defiance. "Now, that ain't friendly, girl," he said, his voice losing some of its easy confidence. "You put that thing down before you hurt yourself. You're coming with me." Calder took a slow step forward, positioning himself between Jonas and Claire. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You're on my land. Turn your horse around and ride away." Jonas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your land I don't think you understand. Friend, this ain't about land. It's about property. That girl belongs to Mr. Silas. He paid good money for her. I'm just here to collect what's his." He swung down from his horse, his movements slow and deliberate. He let the reins drop to the ground. His hand went to the long, wicked-looking knife sheathed at his belt. "I can do this the easy way," he said, his eyes locked on Claire. "Or we can do this the hard way. Makes no difference to me. But one way or another, you're leaving with me." He took a step forward. "Into the house. Claire," Calder said again, his voice a low warning growl, his hand now a white-knuckled fist on the grip of his Colt. But Claire stood her ground. She raised the shotgun, the heavy stock settling awkwardly against her shoulder. She sighted down the long barrels, her hands trembling but her purpose absolute. Jonas saw the movement, and his hand tightened on the hilt of his knife. "Foolish girl," he snarled, and he began to draw the blade from its sheath. The world exploded in a deafening roar. It was not the shotgun. It was Calder's Colt. He had drawn and fired in a single, fluid motion that was too fast for the eye to follow. The shot was not aimed at Jonas. The bullet slammed into the wooden porch post just an inch from Jonas's head, sending a shower of sharp, angry splinters into the air. Jonas froze, his hand still on the hilt of his half-drawn knife, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by the wide-eyed fear of a man who has just come face to face with his own mortality. He stared at the splintered hole in the wood, then at Calder, who stood as still as a statue, the long barrel of his Colt aimed squarely at Jonas's chest, smoke curling from its muzzle. The ringing silence that followed the gunshot was absolute. And into that silence, Claire's voice spoke, clear, cold, and steady. There was no tremor in it, no fear, only a chilling, absolute conviction. "He missed on purpose," she said, her eyes sighting down the barrels of the shotgun, directly at Jonas's heart. "I won't." Jonas's head snapped toward her. He saw her face, her eyes as hard and cold as river stones. He saw the twin black holes of the shotgun barrels, unwavering, promising a brutal and immediate end. He saw a girl who was not pleading, not crying, not running. He saw a girl who was ready to kill him. "You take another step," Claire said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper, "and I'll shoot you right in the heart." The bluff, the arrogance, the cruelty, it all shattered. Jonas saw no mercy in her eyes, only a final, deadly promise. He was a bully and a predator, and his power came from the fear of his victims. But this girl, this woman, was not afraid of him anymore. And the man beside her was a specter of death, waiting for the slightest excuse to send him to his grave. For a long second, he stood there, paralyzed by the twin certainties of his own death. Then, slowly, with a tremor in his hand, he let go of his knife. He took a clumsy step backward, then another, his eyes darting between Calder's unmoving pistol and Claire's steady shotgun. He stumbled back to his horse, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He fumbled with the reins, his movements panicked and clumsy, and scrambled into the saddle. He did not look back. He dug his heels into the horse's flanks, and the animal leaped forward, galloping away in a desperate, frantic flight. Claire and Calder stood side by side, watching him go, until he was once again just a small, insignificant speck on the horizon, swallowed up by the vastness of the plains. The danger was past. The ghost had been face down and sent fleeing back into the shadows. Claire's arms began to shake, a delayed reaction to the adrenaline and the sheer, terrifying weight of her decision. The shotgun suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Calder stepped up onto the porch beside her. He did not speak. He simply reached out and gently took the shotgun from her hands, his fingers brushing against hers. He uncocked the hammers and leaned the weapon back against the wall. Then he looked at her. His face was still serious, the lines etched deep with the tension of the last few minutes. But his eyes were filled with something she had never seen before. It was not just care, not just concern. It was a deep, profound respect. He was no longer looking at a frightened girl he had to protect. He was looking at a partner, an equal. He was looking at the woman who had stood her ground, who had faced down her own past, and who had won. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his touch a silent testament to everything that had just happened between them. And in that quiet, profound gesture, a new chapter of their story began. The silence that Jonas left in his wake was a physical thing, a ringing vacuum where violence had almost been. For a long time, neither of them moved. They stood on the porch, two still figures in the vast, empty landscape, the scent of gunpowder a sharp, acrid tang in the cool air. The sun continued its slow, indifferent descent toward the horizon, painting the undersides of the clouds in fiery shades of orange and rose. The world was the same as it had been 5 minutes before. The fence was still half mended. The horse was still waiting patiently. The wind still whispered through the dry prairie grass. But everything was different. A ghost had been met, not with flight, but with fire and resolve. A line had been drawn, not in the dirt, but in the soul. Claire finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It came out as a long, shuddering sigh, and with it, the last of the adrenaline drained away, leaving her feeling hollowed out and strangely light. The shotgun had been a terrible, absolute weight in her hands, but the feeling of standing her ground, of refusing to be a victim, had filled her with a strength she had never known. Calder turned to her, his face still a mask of grim seriousness. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take her chin in his hand, tilting her face up to the light. His pale eyes searched hers, looking for any sign of shattering, any trace of the terrified girl she had been. He found none. He saw the tremor in her hands, the exhaustion in her posture, but in her eyes, he saw a steady, unwavering flame. He saw the woman she had just become. His thumb brushed lightly against her cheek, a gesture of profound, unspoken praise. "You were brave," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of the steel he had just witnessed. "I was terrified," she confessed, her voice a whisper. "But I was more afraid of running again." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then let his hand fall. "Let's put the horse away," he said, turning back to the familiar, grounding work of their daily lives. The crisis was over. The world's rhythm had to be restored. They moved in a new kind of syncopation, their old, quiet rhythm now underscored by the shared, unspoken memory of the confrontation. They untacked the horse, rubbed him down, gave him fresh water and grain. Their hands brushed as they worked. And this time, the touch was not a hesitant question or a surprising discovery. It was a simple, solid fact, a comfort. When the chores were done, the sun was a fiery red smear on the horizon, and the first shy stars were beginning to appear in the deep, velvet sky. The air grew colder, the kind of clean, sharp chill that feels like a promise of a clear night. Calder built up the fire in the hearth, while Claire made coffee, her movements slow and deliberate. The familiar domestic rituals were a balm to her frayed nerves. This was real. The smell of coffee, the warmth of the fire, the solid walls of the cabin around her. This was her life now. The ghosts of her past had come for her, and she had sent them away. She had earned this peace. When the coffee was ready, Calder was sitting on the edge of the small porch, his back against a post, staring out at the darkening plains. He had a thick wool blanket draped over his shoulders. Claire poured 2 tin cups of the steaming black liquid and carried them outside. She handed one to him, and he took it without a word, his fingers wrapping around the warm tin. She hesitated for a moment, then sat down beside him, not close enough to touch, but near enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She pulled a corner of the blanket and draped it over her own shoulders, a shared warmth against the coming night. For a long time, they sat in silence, sipping their coffee, watching as the last vestiges of color bled from the sky and the vast, starry expanse of the prairie night revealed itself. The silence was deep and comfortable, filled with everything that had happened and everything that was now possible. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice soft in the great quiet. "I remember the first night I saw this sky," she said, her gaze on the glittering sweep of the Milky Way. "From the window of the stagecoach station, I thought it was the loneliest thing I had ever seen, just cold and empty and too big." Calder made a low sound of agreement in his throat, but said nothing, letting her speak. "Tonight," she continued, a note of wonder in her voice, "it's beautiful. It doesn't feel lonely at all." She turned her head to look at him, his strong profile silhouetted against the starlight. "This place, it's the first place I've ever felt home." The word, once spoken, hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. She felt a sudden surge of fear. Had she said too much? Had she presumed a permanence that he had never offered? The future was a vast, uncharted territory, and she had just staked a claim. She set her cup down on the rough porch boards and, gathering all the courage she possessed, she closed the small gap between them and leaned her shoulder against his. He was as solid and unmoving as a rock, but she felt him take a deep, slow breath. He did not pull away. "I used to not trust anyone," she whispered, the words a confession to the darkness. "Not my father. Certainly not men like Silas. I thought trust was something you were born with, and I just wasn't. I thought the whole world was a place you had to run from." She felt his arm move, and then his hand came to rest on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm, a silent encouragement to continue. "But being here," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "with you, I don't feel like I have to run anymore." She took a shaky breath, laying her heart bare. "So, if you still want me, if you'll have me, I don't want to leave, ever." The silence that followed was the most profound of all. It was a silence in which her entire future was weighed. She waited, her heart a wild bird in her chest, for his answer. She had offered him everything she was, everything she hoped to be. He could accept it, or he could gently turn it away. He shifted his weight, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he was going to pull away, to stand up, to break the fragile connection. But instead, he turned his head, and his voice, when he spoke, was a low, rough murmur, thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I was always waiting for you to say that, Claire." Relief, pure and absolute, washed over her, so powerful it almost made her weep. He had not just been sheltering her. He had not just been protecting her. He had been waiting. He had been hoping. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. She let out a soft, happy sigh and rested her head on his shoulder, fitting into the space as if she had been made for it. His arm tightened around her, pulling her closer, and he rested his cheek against the top of her head. They sat like that for a long time, two small figures against the vast, star-dusted plains, wrapped in the same blanket, their quiet breaths mingling in the cold night air. They had found their place in the world, and it was with each other. Later, when the fire had burned down to embers and the cabin was filled with a soft, warm glow, they prepared for bed. The soaked cot in the corner stood as a silent testament to the night before, a relic of a time of fear and separation that already felt a lifetime away. There was no question of where she would sleep tonight. It was an unspoken, settled fact. He added a log to the fire, ensuring it would burn warm and steady through the night. As she turned down the heavy wool blanket on his bedroll, she slid under the covers. The familiar scent of wood smoke and clean wool a profound comfort. He lay down beside her, and the bedroll that had once felt so vast now felt perfectly, snugly right. This time, she did not turn her back to him. She lay on her side, facing him, the firelight playing over the strong, quiet lines of his face. He looked at her, his pale eyes dark and deep in the shadows. And in them, she saw a universe of things he would never say, but that she now understood completely. She reached out a hand and gently touched his cheek, his beard rough against her palm. "Calder," she whispered, saying his name for the first time with a sense of pure, unadulterated rightness. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment. He was a man who had lived his life in a fortress of solitude, and she had, somehow, found the gate. A final, lingering shadow of the girl she used to be surfaced, a last whisper of the fear that had defined her for so long. But now, it was not a statement of terror, but one of intimate, vulnerable truth. "I've never slept beside anyone," she murmured, her voice soft as a moth's wing. Calder opened his eyes, a small, slow smile. The first she had ever truly seen, touched the corners of his mouth, crinkling the weary lines around his eyes into something that looked like pure happiness. He did not say a word. He simply reached out, his large, warm hand taking the edge of the thick quilt, and gently, tenderly, pulled it up over her shoulder, tucking her in, and then he leaned in close, his voice a low, warm whisper against her hair. "You are now." Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. For extra support, please consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.